Gaggle will be challenged, and if necessary, destroy media narratives on George Samueli. And it is now 9:13 p.m. in a somewhat cold and dark Budapest. You can even see I'm wearing a sweater. That's how warm it is here in Budapest. And of course, the days are getting very very short, and already it's time to prepare for fall and winter, and to start thinking about the what those gas bills are going to add up to when the cold weather starts. But on a more cheerful note. Thank you, everybody who has joined me. As a friend Peter Kovac says, "See you, George. Just see you, Peter." Um, So, we got naturally all the nonsense about Trump supposedly not knowing what the official language in Liberia is. This is always really, really tedious because the people who make a big issue of these things, namely journalists, have absolutely no idea themselves what Liberia is, what the official language of Liberia is, what the capital of Liberia is, where Liberia is. But then, when any politician makes some mistake, they get to feel very superior. And having done a quick Google search, they're able to assure their audiences that they, of course, would never, never have said anything so ridiculous as suggesting that Liberia language is anything other than English. So that's a triviality out of the way. So today we had Marco Rubio, the U.S. Secretary of State, in Kuala Lumpur, in Malaysia. He was at the ASEAN meeting, and he had a meeting with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, and this was an unexpected meeting, and naturally, uh, uh, Rubio was asked extensively about it during his news conference, and he seemed to suggest that somehow they had some kind of a little um, uh, you know, Julian says, no point talking about USA schizophrenia official announcers anymore. It's all lost energy. Well, maybe so. Um, but so during the news conference, let's take a look at what Rubio actually said. And here, this is interesting. Let me look at this. Peter Kovac. Actually, it's not Kovac, it's Kovac. He says, "Can you please, George? Can you explain why Nixon liked the Shah so much?" Well, in the first place, the Shah was beloved by every U.S. President ever since he was installed into power following the overthrow of uh, Mossadegh in 1953. And so every U.S. president, um, treated him as if he was a major statesman, and we would wear all this regal gear, and it seemed all very impressive. So they all kind of took him as a model of a kind of modernizing Muslim who was aligned with the West. And that was the crucial thing. His father was, of course, also a kind of a modernizing, the sort of the, and everyone kind of was trying to be Ataturk. They're trying to do what Ataturk did in Turkey, somehow get rid of all the all the old baggage of Islamism and try to be a modern state. But Ataturk had kind of mixed um, attitudes towards the West, and the Shah's father, Reza Shah, really wasn't very well disposed towards the West, and indeed, so much so that he was toppled. He was toppled in 1941 jointly by the British and the Soviets because he was insufficiently supportive of the war effort against Nazi Germany. But in terms of his son, who was a kind of a very weak, ineffectual leader, he was a modernizer, trying to, bring Persia and Islam kicking and screaming into the 20th century, and he was pro-Western. So he's like, he's on our side. And so every U.S. president, ever since the Shah was installed into power in 1953, every single one admired him. Now, the Nixon thing is quite interesting because when Nixon came to power in 1969, he more or less decided that the Vietnam venture had to be brought to an end. The United States just really didn't have the will, the stamina, or the interest in pursuing this war in Vietnam. So it had to be brought to an end, and that means that that whole U.S. containment policy, as articulated by Kennan, but then given a much greater energy by NSC 1968, NSC 68 by Paul Nitze, which means that somehow the United States would be responsible for thwarting Soviet expansionism everywhere, in every part of the world. That whole venture, that containment policy, as articulated NSC 68, that wherever the Soviets expand, there the United States would be to resist Soviet expansionism. So that view, I think Nixon realized that we just can't do it. It was clear that that the communists were determined to prevail in Vietnam, and the United States wasn't willing to go on fighting endlessly in the jungles of Southeast Asia to resist Soviet expansionism. So once he made that decision that the containment policy, the old containment policy, really wasn't viable anymore, then they had to think of something else. And what they came up with was the so-called Nixon doctrine, whereby the United States would cede power to other states who would be kind of America's junior partners, or sheriffs, sheriffs deputized for the job, and so there would be no need for a major U.S. military presence in the Persian Gulf, because we had this fantastic leader, the Shah of Iran, to do our work for us. And so Nixon really elevated the Shah, as he elevated the Saudi Arabia, whoever was the king. Was it? I think King Faisal was. I think King Faisal was the king of Saudi Arabia at the time. So he elevated them. So he was both the Shah and King Faisal. Iran and Saudi Arabia now became the United States deputized sheriffs. They would be doing the containment policy that the United States was no longer willing to do. And that's why the Shah was kind of elevated. So he was already elevated by, supposedly this modernizing, Muslim, bringing, Muslim Persia kicking and screaming into the 20th century. And so that was great. But now he was elevated as a key ally in the Cold War. Of course, it was all quite ridiculous because anybody who knew anything about the Shah knew that he was a total buffoon, co- completely in over his head, and that sooner or later he was going to end in disaster. And but successive U.S. leaders, I mean, so there was obviously Nixon, and then Ford. Ford is just a continuation of Nixon. Then, of course, Jimmy Carter. But Jimmy Carter was also under this illusion that the Shah was some really vital U.S. ally who could be relied on to resist the Soviets. Because there's no way that Iran could ever resist the Soviets. I mean, the Soviets obviously had no intention of invading Iran, but it was very dubious even whether the Shah, could survive politically within Iran. But at the time, nobody really thought that the thrust, the real opposition to the Shah would come from the Muslim clerics. That the who would win out in Iran would be the Islamists, because the real fear was that the communists would win out in Iran, because the left was quite powerful in Iran, particularly the Iranian Communist Party, the Tudeh, was very powerful, and I think that was the fear that the communists would take power in Iran, and and that's why they get into it. Marty is now, well, Marty. So he's given us a picture of Nixon sitting with Tito, and so this is in the Oval Office, and Tito is lighting up a cigar. But Nixon, he was very expressive. His facial expressions were always very interesting. No, is this picture? There's a more interesting picture. Where is it? I can't. Let's see. Yeah, there's when Nixon kind of looks at him sideways. He's not entirely comfortable with somebody just lighting up a cigar in the Oval Office, and but again, why Tito? I mean, it's like it's very much connected with what we were talking about with the Shah. That Tito, though a communist, was embraced by the United States following the rift with Stalin. It suddenly, all the huge amount of aid poured into Yugoslavia, and Tito was welcomed everywhere. And as you can see here, he's welcomed in the Oval Office because he was seen as a vital ally in the Cold War. So though he was a communist, he was a vital ally because he was against the Soviets, and he was giving the Soviets headaches, because the Soviets would be very worried that the other communist states would seek the example of Tito, and would carve out an independent role for themselves. That really never happened. It was somewhat exaggerated. While it's true that Tito did, pursue a kind of an independent foreign policy, and he did pursue, a more humane, more humane form of communism than that practiced within the Soviet Union or in the Soviet bloc. Though Hungary's communism wasn't really that bad either. Though in Yugoslavia there was a great deal of cultural freedom, with cinema and philosophy and so on, much more so than in Hungary. But when push came to shove, um, Yugoslavia didn't really um, take too many risks. Um, Something that would really antagonize the Soviets. I mean, for instance, in '56 in Hungary, they they granted um, immunity to Imre Nagy. Imre Nagy was trying to flee the Soviet tanks, and so they did grant him asylum. The Soviets basically they seized him. He was in the bus going to the Yugoslav embassy. The Soviets seized the bus and arrested Nagy, and then of course went ahead and executed Nagy. I mean, the Yugoslavs were unhappy about that because it was obviously um, an act of disrespect for them. But they just they held their tongue. They didn't make too much of an issue of it, largely because they didn't really approve of what Imre Nagy had done in Hungary. But nonetheless, it's that picture that Marty has posted, where Nixon's looking at him a little warily as he's lighting up a cigar. It's a good reflection of just what the situation was in the Cold War, where this communist enjoyed open access to wherever he wanted, the Oval Office, gets to see the U.S. president because he's a vital ally um, in the fight against the Soviet Union. But of course, that was also the case with Ceausescu for quite some time, because Ceausescu, though the communism under Ceausescu wasn't in any way as liberal or tolerant as it was under Tito, but because relations between Romania and the Soviet Union weren't great, Ceausescu was also treated as an ally. And Nixon visited Romania very early during his presidency, which was quite a remarkable thing. I mean, a U.S. president coming to visit Romania, but hey, Romania is kind of on our side. My enemy's enemy is my friend. So, but anyway, just to finish up on the Shah, he was a key player in the Nixon doctrine. The Nixon doctrine. Hey, well, this is how we're going to deal with the Soviets in the kind of post-containment era. We just have to put containment on the back burner. The American people aren't willing to go on fighting the communists everywhere all the time. They just basically they're not interested. They don't have the energy for it, and so they say, well, we're going to have to delegate the fight to others. So I think that's kind of why Nixon elevated the Shah. But I was, as I just to conclude, so did Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was singing the praises of the Shah really just a few months before his ouster. The Shah obviously was a totally a kind of remarkable popular uprising that included the entirety of Iranian society that rose up against him. But just a few months before that, Jimmy Carter was singing the Shah's praises. And so fond was Jimmy Carter of the Shah that, despite warnings not to do it, he allowed the Shah to enter the United States to get medical treatment, and of course that led to the seizure of the U.S. embassy in Tehran. So he did it, even though his diplomats said, "Hey, this is a really bad idea. This is really going to go down badly in Iran if the Shah is allowed to enter the country to get medical treatment. But Jimmy Carter did it. Like many other things, he was driven by strange moral concerns of his own, and not by any realpolitik or any sense of what's good for America. Anyway, so I was saying in Kuala Lumpur, um, Marco Rubio met Sergei Lavrov, and he was then interrogated about it. Where do I have that now? Let me just find this. Yeah. Okay. Now. Yes. So here is he doing this news conference, and he was obviously asked. Most of the news conference was taken up by questions about what did you talk about with Lavrov. And I have to say that the Russian readout about the meeting is very terse. I mean, there's almost nothing in it. And Rubio says, well, we shared some ideas and comments, which I'll take back to Washington as early as this evening in terms of calls and reflect, and perhaps there's something to build on there. So, but it was a frank conversation. It was an important one. We had it, and we talked about some other items unrelated to the war in Ukraine. But that was the first and foremost topic that we discussed. And look, the president's pretty clear. He's disappointed and frustrated that there's not been more flexibility on the Russian side to bring an end to the conflict. We hope that can change, and we're going to continue to stay involved where we see opportunities to make a difference. And then, and so I'm not going to characterize our conversation other than to tell you that I expressed what the president said publicly, which is that we feel as if we've dedicated a lot of time and energy to this matter, and just not enough progress has been made. We need to see a roadmap moving forward about how this conflict can conclude. And then we shared some ideas of what that might look like. And obviously, I'll take that back to the president here as early as this evening. And then goes on. A question was a couple of months ago, you said that what was necessary to end this war would be a conversation between President Trump and President Putin. But there have now been multiple phone calls between the two of them, and yet the war in Ukraine goes on. Does this speak to any weakness in terms of the president's ability to negotiate an end to this conflict? Or why does it persist despite them having spoken? Well, this is a war that the president inherited, right? He got elected, and it had already been going on, and no progress has been made up to that point towards a peace of any kind. In fact, there had not even been any meetings between the Ukrainians and the Russians for quite some time. So while there's been humanitarian exchanges made, obviously that's our goal here, to end this war in any role we can play. So it doesn't really answer the question. So this is not a war that was started under President Trump. It's a war that wouldn't have happened had he been president. The familiar talking point. And then again, well, Russia's launched these massive attacks. Are you willing now to put stronger sanctions on Russia? Always, there's going to be someone's going to ask, well, what about the sanctions? And well, the president has said that's an option that's available to him, both under existing authorities, but primarily if the Senate and the House can pass legislation that gives him an opportunity to do that. Obviously, the president needs flexibility, and then let's go on, yeah. And then, Mr. Secretary, you mentioned wanting to see a roadmap for how this conflict can conclude. What concrete ideas have been presented, and how did Russia respond in this meeting? And says, well, again, these things are best negotiated. I don't want to in private. There were some ideas exchanged today, some viewpoints that they expressed to us that I'll take back to the president for his consideration, and hopefully it will lead to something. I don't want to overpromise something. Again, as I said, this is a conflict that's been going on now for over 3 years, and as has already been pointed out by one of the questions, and that was an acceleration of the attacks, and then then they talk about, well, we've got to stop the people dying and so on, and then about the loss of lives, and that's it. Now, what interesting is here is his suggestion that there was some new idea presented by Lavrov. I somehow doubt it. I really doubt that there was anything new. The Russians have been remarkably consistent in what they've been saying. I mean, they don't really um, change their position very much, and as we've discussed many times before, Lavrov's speeches tend to be quite repetitious. So I'm sure whatever he said, it was probably along the lines that, well, we had the coup in 2014. They've been persecuting Russian speakers. We can't allow the neo-Nazis to remain in power. We can't have NATO expansion and so on. So I don't know what he's saying, what new ideas Lavrov could have conveyed to him. As I said, the Russian readout said nothing. Just, oh yeah, we had a nice exchange of views and talked about lots of different things, and that's about it. So, I really don't see anything very much here, that from when we're talking about um, Trump's moves on Ukraine. He by failing to get his hands around this war at an early stage in his administration, he has inevitably been sucked in to pursuing this war, continuing to deliver arms for Ukraine, and therefore just continuing a war without any end game, without any real strategy, without any real sense of how does this benefit the United States. Essentially, we would just be pursuing the Biden policy, and I don't see anything happening here to change it. And meanwhile, we had another one of these meetings in Europe, in Rome this time, where again, all sorts of arms being promised to Zelensky. We're back on the Patriot missiles. Who's going to provide the Patriot missiles? So that's there's not really much prospect of any change. I mean, it was worth mentioning only that Rubio's comment that he's seen some new idea from the Russians and he's seemed quite excited. He's going to go back to Washington. Marty says Ursula's recovery. Yes, Ursula. Oh yeah, that was. Let me look at it. Marty's pictures are always great. Let me take a look. Yeah, that's Ursula and her girlfriend Georgia Maloney. So yeah, Ursula had a vote of confidence, which, shock horror, she won. However, it wasn't a particularly convincing victory because it was basically she won by a margin of 2-1, which means basically a third of the MEPs voted against her. So that was that's not exactly a ringing vote of confidence. So that's one thing. Now, the other thing is the DOJ. We're now being told in the media the DOJ is investigating, is kind of bringing an investigation against James Comey and John Brennan, who was, of course, both of whom were actively involved in Russiagate, um, and, um, and you know, then we know, of course, that there's been no reckoning of any kind on Russiagate. Now, I have to say, I'm very skeptical that anything at all is going to come of this. I mean, it's not just the issue of the statute of limitations. So if they bring up um, uh, lying under oath, that statute of limitations has passed. You know, that well past. There's a 5-year statute of limitation. Now, it is true that Matt Gaetz claims that Brennan lied much more recently than that. He said that in 2023, when Brennan testified before his committee, that he had clearly perjured himself. So maybe you could get something on that. But I mean, I think there may well be a criminal conspiracy that they had engaged in. But the reason I have my doubts is that you don't really make an announcement. Well, we're kind of looking into it. You know, we're going to do this investigation. You just go ahead and do it. So when you storm into Comey's house at 5:30 in the morning and grab all his papers and all his electronic devices and computers and everything, and then haul them off to FBI headquarters, then you think, okay, well, that looks serious to me, which is what the DOJ did with the various people, the various Trump people whom it investigated during the during the Trump years. You know, it's like it was Trump's DOJ that was arresting Trump supporters, and then, you know, whether it was Paul Manafort and whatever, they were being hauled in. Trump's DOJ going after Trump's people, but that was being done. And then, well, if the FBI comes knocking on your door at 5:30 in the morning to haul away all of your papers and your electronic devices, then you know that they're serious, and then you know that I think an indictment is going to come soon. But when you were told, well, we've opened an investigation, then it ain't going to happen. But anyway, here's the New York Times story about this, and it says here, the Trump administration appears to be targeting officials who oversaw the investigation into the 2016 Trump campaign's connections to Russia, examining the actions of the former FBI Director James Comey and former CIA Director John Brennan. Now, firstly, even in this opening sentence, it says the Trump campaign's connections to Russia. How about saying the Trump campaign's alleged connections to Russia, because no such connections have ever been proven? But the Times just puts it in as if that's a real thing. Trump campaign's connections to Russia. And it says John Ratcliffe, the CIA director and a harsh critic of his Democratic appointed predecessors, has made a criminal referral of Mr. Brennan to the FBI, accusing him of lying to Congress. The Bureau is also scrutinizing Mr. Comey for his role in the Russia investigation. And then he goes on, the Brennan referral stems from the CIA's recent review of its 2016 intelligence assessment on Russian interference in that year's presidential elections. While the new review did not undercut the findings of the earlier assessment, it was deeply critical of Mr. Brennan and his oversight of the analytic work. Um, well, I mean, if you call into question the methodology, you're kind of calling into question the findings. I mean, you could, if you say the methodology left a lot to be desired, then you're sort of saying the findings are pretty useless. I mean, that's fairly. Oh no, the findings are fine, but the methodology, it was just the methodology that was a problem. That doesn't work like that. And then, so the recent review criticized the agency's top leadership, including Mr. Brennan, for rushing the Trump-Russia inquiry, but did not dispute the core conclusion that Russia favored Mr. Trump over Mrs. Clinton in the 2016 election. Well, notice how devious the Times formulation here is. It says, did not dispute the core conclusion that Russia favored Mr. Trump over Mrs. Clinton in the 2016 election. Well, it may be. It may be that the Russian government favored Mr. Trump over Mrs. Clinton, since they knew that they had nothing to expect from Hillary Clinton, but at least they had some hope that with Trump, a kind of an outsider, he's not carrying any of the usual Washington baggage, a businessman, pragmatic. Under Trump, relations with the United States might improve, as they still have that attitude towards Trump. They still have yet to say anything negative about him. But it's one thing to say that Russia favored Mr. Trump. It's quite another thing to say that the Russian government interfered in the 2016 election to secure of the victory of Mr. Trump, which is what Russiagate was supposed to be about. You know, whether Russians individually like Trump more than they do Hillary Clinton, that's neither here nor there. They said that Russia interfered in that election, but the Times deliberately elides over that distinction. The review reflected Mr. Ratcliffe's longtime criticism of his predecessor, but also the discomfort of some longtime analysts felt about Mr. Brennan's unusual hands-on role in producing the assessment. Well, that was the whole point. The ICA that was produced during the last days of the Obama administration was ordered by Obama. It was Obama did this. Obama had already set out the findings. Obama had already made the claim that Russia had interfered in that election, and he basically instructed Brennan to issue a finding confirming what Obama had already claimed. And what Brennan did, he didn't do a proper, and we've known this, he didn't do a proper intelligence finding. He handpicked the people who would draft this ICA. He handpicked them. In other words, they were the people who could be relied upon to declare, Russia interfered in this election. So it was not in any way a proper finding where you go to all the intelligence experts, all the specialists who know about Russia, who follow Russia, and ask for their input. You handpick the people that you can be sure of are going to confirm what you want confirmed. And then here, the review, which was declassified and released late last month, said that Mr. Brennan had pushed for the inclusion of a so-called Steele dossier, a collection of unverified allegations about Mr. Trump that was assembled by a former British intelligence officer. Yes, and all the rest about the FBI's involvement with Steele. FBI paid Steele. So by the say, oh, he was a former British intelligence officer. He was paid by the FBI. The FBI gave him a lot of money. The new review said that while CIA analysts have raised concern about the dossier, Mr. Brennan appeared more swayed by the dossier's general conformity with existing theories than by legitimate tradecraft concerns. According to the review, Mr. Brennan ultimately formalized his position in writing, stating that my bottom line is that I believe that the information warrants inclusion in the report. But see, this is where I think Brennan's vulnerability will arise, because I think Brennan, this is what Matt Gaetz was saying, that Brennan had denied that the Steele dossier had played any role in the ICA. It's clear, and that Brennan had played no role in the inclusion of the Steele dossier in the ICA. The CIA offered little context for Mr. Brennan's written remark. The new review does not say whether that comment was about whether to include the dossier in the annex or whether Mr. Brennan allowed it to influence the overall assessment. Well, both. Something he had repeatedly and strenuously denied. And then in his memoir and in testimony to Congress, Mr. Brennan said he supported CIA analysts who opposed the inclusion of the dossier in the intelligence assessment, and that the dossier was ultimately summarized in an annex to the document. The dossier did not inform any of the analysis or the judgments in the assessment itself, Mr. Brennan wrote in his book Undaunted. But this is the point. If we look at what this is the CIA declassified report that came out last month. And then this is what it says: the decision by the agency heads to include the Steele dossier in the ICA ran counter to fundamental tradecraft principles and ultimately undermined the credibility of a key judgment. The ICA authors first learned of the dossier and FBI's leadership's insistence on its inclusion. So that's FBI leadership. That's already Comey. Comey insists on the inclusion of the dossier. So essentially, the FBI is lending its imprimatur to the dossier, and we know he did it. He did it when it went after it got those warrants for surveillance of Carter Page. It claimed that the dossier was highly credible, and then, of course, it then deceitfully and knowingly deceitfully included in its warrant application the Yahoo article written by Isikoff, Michael Isikoff, which was entirely based on Steele's briefing. So I said, "Oh, we've got an independent source of information about Carter Page," when they knew that Isikoff's story was entirely based on the briefing by Christopher Steele. So anyway, that was the FBI. FBI insisted on the Steele dossier, and then remember how Comey tried to set Trump up when he told Trump about the Steele dossier, and then was watching carefully how Trump would react to this information about the Steele dossier. And then he rushed down to the car, and there was already a laptop waiting for him in the car so that he can then type up his impressions of this meeting with Trump and how Trump responded to this disclosure by Comey about the Steele dossier. Anyway, of FBI leadership's insistence on its inclusion on the 20th of December, that's on 2016, the same day the largely coordinated draft was entering the review process at CIA. FBI leadership made it clear that their participation in the ICA hinged on the dossier's inclusion. So they said, we won't participate in this unless you include the dossier. So that's again coming from Comey. And over the next few days, repeatedly pushed to weave references to it throughout the main body of the ICA. And then the ICA authors and multiple senior CIA managers, including the two senior leaders of the CIA Mission Center responsible for Russia, strongly opposed including the dossier. So here we have multiple senior CIA managers strongly opposed including the dossier. So how did it get in there? If senior CIA people said you can't include the dossier, asserting, why can't you include it? Asserting that it did not meet even the most basic tradecraft standards. CIA's Deputy Director for Analysis warned in an email to Brennan on 29th of December that including it in any form risked the credibility of the entire paper, and yet it got in there. So therefore, Brennan had to have insisted on including it. It was Brennan's document. So I think they've got him on perjury. I think, given this information, since he this was in 2023 when he denied that he had anything to do with including the Steele dossier. Says here, despite these objections, Brennan showed a preference for narrative consistency over analytical soundness. When confronted with specific flaws in the dossier by the two mission center leaders, one with extensive operational experience and the other with strong analytic background, he appeared more swayed by the dossier's general conformity with existing theories. In other words, it's a fraud, a hoax. It's, in other words, because it conforms with my prejudices, it's completely worthless, intellectually worthless. It's completely evidence-free. It's ludicrous on its face, but because it confirms my prejudices and because it confirms what Obama wanted confirmed in order to sabotage the Trump presidency, namely that Trump was really working for the Russians, because it confirmed all of that, Brennan pushed for it to be included in the ICA. Brennan ultimately formalized his position in writing, stating that my bottom line is that I believe that the information warrants inclusion in the report. And then ultimately, agency heads decided to include a 2-page summary of the dossier as an annex to the ICA, with a disclaimer that the material was not used to reach analytic conclusion. But of course, that's completely disingenuous, as this declassified report says. However, by placing a reference to the annex material in the main body of the ICA as the fourth supporting bullet for the judgment that Putin, quote, aspired to help Trump win, the ICA implicitly elevated unsubstantiated claims to the status of credible supporting evidence, compromising the analytical integrity of the judgment. Well, it didn't compromise it. It had no credibility. So that's that. Now, I think if they really wanted to pursue the perjury charges against Brennan, they can probably do it. I think that there's enough there to basically suggest that he perjured himself in his testimony. But what I doubt is that they'll actually do it. And that's why the announcement by I guess it's not even an announcement. It's just hints to journalists that this is being done. suggests to me that nothing is going to happen. That it just that's not what you do if you're serious. If you're serious, you basically barge into people's homes at 5 o'clock in the morning and hold them out, in their underwear, while you sweep through the house, collecting all sorts of documentation, and not to mention all what was it? You remember with Paul Manafort, they collected all his suits and everything because they look how expensive these suits are. That shows that he was obviously on the take. So yeah, and collect some suits as well. Look at how expensive these suits are. Anyway, let's take a look at some of the comments on on our locals page, and then I want to talk about another thing. But let's first of all look at the people who keep the dogs going. That the dogs who get very depressed. They feel that they're unrewarded and unappreciated, and so it's very very nice and very touching that we have our Gagglers who try to keep up the spirit of the dogs. So let's look at some of the comments. And Robert, always very good to see you, Robert. And Robert says, "Ciao from New Jersey, where finally we've got a bit of good news. Trump has pulled the plug on federal funding for public schools until the state stops using the money for drag shows and gender theory studies." That is good news. I dare say that even as we speak, there's probably some judge in New Jersey who is putting a stop immediately this denial of federal funds. I mean, it's ridiculous. Just like today, after that, unequivocal ruling from the U.S. Supreme Court, saying you can't issue these nationwide injunctions. The issue was, of course, this birthright citizenship, which as I've said before, though that hasn't yet been decided upon, but it's so obvious that wasn't the intent of the drafters of the 14th Amendment. It would do that somehow anybody who happens to be on the territory of the United States and gives birth on the territory of the United States, that child is somehow automatically a citizen of the United States. I mean, obviously that couldn't have been what the framers of the 14th Amendment intended, and that's why they put in that proviso, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, because it was obviously the issue was how could they guarantee citizenship to slaves and to the children of slaves, the newly liberated slaves. So this came just after the Civil War, the newly liberated slaves, and that's why, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. That clearly, the newly liberated slaves, they may have been born as slaves, but they were clearly subject to the jurisdiction of the United States government. But they didn't mean that somebody, not on the territory, somebody who's even in the country illegally. Somebody's in the country illegally, would still, if she gives birth here, well, that means that's automatically a citizen of the United States. So it's the bizarre notion of liberals. This is it's the purest expression of liberalism. So liberalism, which is that if you're pregnant, then the unborn child has no right to life. Basically, he could be murdered at any time. That's that you don't. But what he does have a right to, he has a right to American citizenship. So if you can avoid getting murdered, which was perfectly legal and acceptable, but if you can avoid that, then you get automatic citizenship. So you don't have a right to life. Sorry, but you do have a right to American citizenship. That's so that's the brilliant logic of contemporary liberalism. Anyway, Robert says. Anyway, how do I get onto that? Yeah, the issue here. So today there was a judge has now done what was inevitable would happen after the Supreme Court had said, well, you can't um, issue nationwide injunctions. They said, okay, well, how do we get around that? We can certify a class. Why don't we certify a class? And then, if it's a class, you know, could be anyone who's in this class. And then once you certify a class, then a judge can rule and essentially issue a temporary injunction that applies to all members of the certified class. And the certified class can be extremely wide. So that's how you've kind of got around the nationwide injunction. Okay, we can't do a nationwide injunction, but we can issue an injunction on behalf of some nebulous class that's just essentially been invented out of whole cloth. And so that was the ruling today, but it was inevitable. And in fact, in the ruling last week, the one by Amy Coney Barrett, in fact, there was a concurrence by Justice Samuel Alito, who did indeed say, yeah, okay, I agree with the nationwide injunction that that was never intended. There was never any intent that judges can simply issue a nationwide injunction. The judges can only litigate, or judges can only make decisions pertaining to the litigants in their courtrooms. They can't issue nationwide injunctions, but he said, we've got to address this class certification because that's how they're going to get around it. And of course, lo and behold, within days, everybody's going around, okay, forget the nationwide injunction, let's just go certify classes. So I would imagine that already there's a judge who is saying a president can't just halt federal funding for public schools because they have drag shows. You can't do that. And then Robert says, weren't the mullahs in Iran also opposed to Mossadegh because of his socialist leanings? Yeah, that's exactly correct, because in fact, they were allies of the CIA and MI6 in that coup, in the 1953 coup, because in fact the mullahs were very unhappy, just as you say, because they didn't like Mossadegh. Yeah, socialism, radicalism, secularism, and they were strongly opposed to it. In fact, that's how the original kind of the bond between the CIA and Khomeini was forged, because the CIA had already known about Khomeini from the days of the coup. He had been allied with the with the CIA in plotting against Mossadegh. So when he came back, which is, it was only about 26 years later, about 25, just about 25 years later, Khomeini was a well-known figure to the Americans. They said, oh yeah, he's okay. He worked with us against Mossadegh. He doesn't like the communists, so we can work with him. And that's why initially there wasn't really that much American hostility towards Khomeini. They saw him as someone that they can work with. Now, obviously, they would have much preferred the the Shah to have stayed, but once they realized that the Shah could not be saved, they figured, well, the next best thing is somebody like Khomeini, because he hates the communists, hates socialism, and we worked with him back then, back in 1953, so we can work with him again, because what the Americans were most concerned about in 1978 was the Tudor party, the communists coming to power. They also the communists were the real threat. So they were willing to support, uh, very happy with Khomeini, and so we think, Khomeini, people interviewing Khomeini, and it was, no one had any real issues with him. Now, as it of course turned out, Khomeini had his own agenda, and yes, though they crushed the Tudor party, they nonetheless were, definitely anti-American, and they certainly didn't like the fact that the Americans had supported the Shah's regime for all these years. So you're right, Robert. I mean, people always say, "Oh, it was the coup that is the key event to explain the hostility of the Islamic Republic," and you're right. I mean, that doesn't explain it, because of course the Islamists themselves hated Mossadegh. They didn't mind the overthrow of Mossadegh, but they didn't like the rule of the Shah. So in fact, they came to hate the Shah more than they actually even hated Mossadegh, because the Shah really went to war against the clerics. That's why Khomeini left the country and so on. So they kind of blame the Americans for supporting the Shah all of these years. And I think that when the students seized the embassy, that was in response to Jimmy Carter's letting the Shah come in to the country for medical treatment. I think the students were probably, under the impression that the Shah would be nursed back to health, and the Americans would seek to reinsert the Shah, just as they did in 1953. And I think that's what caused the extreme agitation when the Americans did that. They're going to do this again. What they're going to do? They're going to bring the Shah back, and all the awful Shah years would return. I mean, of course, it wasn't like that. The Shah died, soon afterwards. But I think that's what that triggered the reaction against it. But the fact is that Khomeini was very anti-communist. He was very anti-socialist, and if you recall, one of Khomeini's earliest acts was the renunciation of the 1921 treaty between Persia, and at that time it wasn't yet the Soviet Union, but the RSFSR, so the Russian Socialist, Soviet Socialist Federal Republic. I think it was before the creation of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union came into existence in 1922, but in 1921, the RSFSR signed a treaty with Persia, which gave the RSFSR the right to intervene in Persia, militarily intervene in Persia, should the RSFSR, it was succeeded by the USSR, should the USSR be threatened by a third power. So if the USSR was threatened by, say, Great Britain or Germany invading the the USSR from Persia, then the USSR would have a unilateral right to intervene militarily in Persia to ward off this threat. So this was a pretty one-sided treaty. I mean, there was no comparable right on the part of Persia to intervene in the RSFSR, the later the USSR, should anyone was threatening Persia. But anyway, this, Khomeini renounced this treaty. Now, the Soviets couldn't have been very happy. They didn't say anything about it, but the Soviets couldn't have been terribly happy about this act on the part of Iran. But this was a real thing. I mean, there was no question. I mean, the Iranians well remembered that after World War II, remember the Britain and the Soviet Union had occupied Persia during World War II. This is they got rid of Reza Shah. They thought he was too pro-German, so they got rid of him. And then the Soviets, after 1945, refused to withdraw from Iran, and then Persia. Then it was I guess that was already, it was called Iran. But and in fact, they set up those two people's republics, this Azeri People's Republic and the Kurdish People's Republic. So already then, Stalin was implicitly invoking the 1921 treaty, that somehow the Soviet Union could be threatened from Persia. Anyway, Khomeini renounced all of that. And Khomeini was very anti the Soviets in Afghanistan. So in many ways, he pursued a policy that the Americans would have been quite happy with. In fact, the Shah had sort of pursued a détente of his own with the Soviet Union. He had tried to improve relations with the Soviets. So from the American point of view, actually things got a little bit better, because now they had a much more anti-Soviet regime in Tehran with Khomeini. But there's just a lot of bad blood before that. And to be honest, I mean, Khomeini just wasn't a particularly astute leader. You never want to be in a situation where you're surrounded by enemies, and that's kind of what happened during the Khomeini years. I mean, things have improved greatly for Iran since then, but Khomeini had bad relations with the United States, bad relations with the Soviet Union. So anyway, then we have Anne-Marie. Always very good to see you. Thank you so much, Anne-Marie. Anne-Marie, of course, is a resident musical expert, a distinguished musician, a violinist, and she made some very interesting comments on a recent Gaggle Music Club, comments about Wagner, which I think everyone should read after listening to the prelude to Die Meistersinger von Nuremberg. So read that, read her comments, and then you can, if you want, you can also read my short response to Anne-Marie's comments. So we try to raise the cultural level at times, So I mean, we talk about all the politics and Brennan and Comey, but sometimes we want to, raise the kind of, let's say, the socioeconomic cultural level a notch or two. So we're talking about more esoteric subject. Robert, for instance, likes to discuss political philosophy, and Anne-Marie talk about music. So we get all sorts of interesting, more culturally elevated discussions. Anyway, thank you so much, Anne Marie. Really appreciate it. And this, God, the picture of Ursula and Maloney. It's that's Judy Hodgkiss. Always good to see you. Thank you, Judy, as always, for your generosity and for your invariably interesting and challenging comments. And so Judy says, what we don't know is when do the Biden appropriated weapons shipments run out? That's a very good question. I'm not sure myself. From just going by newspaper reports, they're going to run out towards the end of the summer. But I don't know if that's true. But that's what the newspaper reports say. They're going to run out by the end of the summer. Do you really think that Trump is going to going back to Congress for more appropriations? Well, up until the last week or so, I wondered about that, and I thought, no, I think he's not going to do it. But now that he's committed himself to this policy of supporting Ukraine, that always got to do all this for Ukraine, and we got a good call with Zelensky. They're getting hit very hard. They need defensive weapons. They need to defend themselves against Russia. Now that he's gone on record saying that, I think he will. I actually think now he will go back and ask for more. I don't see why he wouldn't, because if he said, "Well, I'm not going to do it," then he will have gone back on all the things that he's been saying really during the past couple of weeks. So I do think that he's going to do it. I think, however, that it'll be much more since he talks about defensive, whatever he means by that, defensive. So I think that's what the emphasis will be on. The Patriot systems, air defense systems. So I think that's what he will focus. But I think I actually do think he's going to do it. What is interesting is how much, and no doubt they're going to put put some kind of a nice spin on it by claiming that it's not just that it's defensive, but that it's a loan. It's not actually, it's a loan. So, we're going to get all this money back from Ukraine. Probably the issue of the economic deal, the rare earth deal, or whatever Trump refers to it, that will be brought up. Yeah, the Ukraine's going to pay for it. We signed this deal for this extraction, oil extraction, coal, whatever, and Ukraine's going to pay us back. So I think that's how they're going to sell it. It's defensive, and it's not really a handout. Ukraine is going to pay for it, down the road. But that's why Trump, signed that extraction agreement. But I think it will come. Anyway, Judy, thank you so much for your generosity and for all of your really stimulating comments. Carlos, good to see you, Carlos. I was a little worried about you, given your last post, but Carlos has good news. Good news, doctor. Got a new job. Congratulations. Really happy for you. Got a new job. Here's something for my canine cousins. Canine cousins. Thank you very much, Carlos. Really happy for you that you've got a new job. Hope all the other things you'll get that back. I don't know if you'll get your bicycle back, but I'm sure you'll be able to. You'll be able to buy, now that you've got a new job, you'll be able to buy a new bicycle. About your heart being broken, well, I hope you'll be able to address that as well in the near future. So the other thing I wanted to talk about is that today is July the 10th, and so every year around this time we get these stories in the media about Srebrenica. And the reason um, why I wanted to address that because it happens every July the 10th or whatever is the is that it's the founding myth of NATO. It's the founding myth of the new NATO, the post-Cold War NATO. So if you remember, in 1990, 1991, there was a real problem about the rationale for the continued existence of NATO. And so well, if there's no Soviet Union, if there's no Warsaw Pact, if there's no threat to the West, what do we need NATO for? So they had to come up with all sorts of rationales for its continued existence, and not just the continued existence, as it turned out, already the expansion, because the expansion of NATO, the plans for the expansion began almost immediately in 1991, 1992, 1993. It was already all the plans were put in place to induct into NATO the former members of the Warsaw Pact. But what was the rationale? And so the original rationale, was that, well, the one George H.W. Bush, he talked about instability. Oh, well, if we don't have, if all these newly independent states aren't in NATO, then there's going to be instability. That was never explained, since essentially it was a circular argument. If NATO is stability, that means if you define NATO as the guarantor of stability, then anyone who's not in NATO is obviously fostering instability, and therefore this is highly undesirable, and therefore you must be inducted into NATO. It was a perfectly ridiculous circular argument. It wasn't very convincing, but what really got things moving was the war in Yugoslavia, which of course was triggered by the NATO countries, because of the way that they rushed the disintegration of Yugoslavia, engineered in large part by Germany, but not by just Germany alone. Germany provided the initial impetus for the breakup of Yugoslavia, but then the United States joined in, and by 1992, really Yugoslavia was no more. Of course, it triggered a war, and everybody knew it would trigger a war, and it was done, with the push to break Yugoslavia up was always done in the expectation that it would lead to a war, and therefore in the expectation that this would prove to be a boon for NATO, because anybody who knew anything at all about Yugoslavia, whether it was Lord Carrington, who chaired the Yugoslav conference, whether it was Cyrus Vance, who was the UN representative to Yugoslavia, and even David Owen, who was the EU representative to Yugoslavia. Any one of them would have known and knew that this is going to lead to the civil war within Yugoslavia. And when Perez de Cuellar, the UN Secretary General, had warned, do not recognize the secessionist republics, because if you recognize them and essentially provide the kind of the legal sort of spurious legal imprimatur to the secessionists who are completely acting illegally, then you will have essentially sanctified illegal secessions, and therefore you will encourage others to secede from the secessionist states, which is exactly what happened. So from Croatia, Germany recognizes the secession of Croatia and Slovenia, and then of course the Serbs say, well, we don't want to be a part of this independent state of Croatia. We want to be a part of Yugoslavia. But the biggest disaster of all was, of course, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where essentially the Muslims were really only 43% of the population. The Serbs were were about 30%, and then the Croats were about 17%, and the rest identified as Yugoslavs. But Yugoslavs generally were Serbs. Serbs, were kind of liberal Serbs would identify as Yugoslavs. And so the war was inevitable, and then the Americans did what they always do. They kept a war going. They continued to keep this war going, even though there were all sorts of mechanisms along the way to bring the war to an end. There was all the various peace plans. The most famous one, the one that would have avoided the war altogether, was the Carrington-Cutiliero plan. That was from April 1992, May 1992. And then, of course, there was the Vance-Owen plan. There was the Owen-Stoltenberg plan. All of these plans could have ended the war because the Serbs had accepted these agreements. Well, one would have to distinguish here because Milosevic accepted all of these agreements. The Bosnian Serbs had accepted the Cutiliero, the Carrington-Cutiliero plan, and the Bosnian Serbs accepted the Owen-Stoltenberg plan. The Bosnian Serbs, and this is where the divisions arose. Karadzic, who didn't want to accept the Vance-Owen plan, he was pressed by Milosevic to accept it. Because Milosevic was very shrewd. He kind of understood that we need to end this war as quick as possible because NATO is going to come in. NATO is absolutely going to do it. So just get it out of the way and prevent this NATO attack. And so he prevailed upon Karadzic to accept the Vance-Owen plan, but then Karadzic said, well, even if I accept it, the Bosnian Serbs should have a referendum on whether they accept the Vance-Owen plan, because the referendum went overwhelmingly against it, and so they didn't accept that plan. But the next year there was the Owen-Stoltenberg plan, which the Bosnian Serbs did accept. But the point is that by not accepting these plans, by essentially sabotaging this, the Americans rejected all of them. Then the war they kept the war going, just as exactly the same, the model that they've used in Ukraine, just keep it going. And of course, the longer you keep it going, then the more likely is it that something very bad is going to happen. And something very bad did indeed happen in Srebrenica. Now, the outlines of the story is always distorted in the media, because the way the media presented is that somehow the Serbs killed 8,000 men and boys, which never really makes any sense. Why would they kill 8,000 men and boys? What about the girls? Why didn't they kill the girls? So the moment they say men and boys, well, men and boys are usually the ones who are doing the fighting. And so when you kill men and boys, that means you're killing fighters. And therefore, it's likely that they were killed in combat, which is largely what happened. So the ghastly, people, we still have never really got to grips with the revolting, repugnant, disgusting, loathsome Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright. But Madeleine Albright was the UN during Clinton's first term. She was the U.S. permanent representative at the UN at the United Nations, and she had pushed for this creation of so-called safe areas. And so there were 6 safe areas, but Srebrenica was the first safe area. So they created this safe area in Srebrenica, and then so dazzled was the UN Security Council at this brilliant idea of creating Srebrenica as a safe area that they extended the safe area to a number of other cities in Bosnia and Herzegovina. But by a strange coincidence, these cities were all controlled by the Bosnian Muslims. And by a strange coincidence, each of these safe areas were actually bases for the Bosnian Muslim military. All the Bosnian Muslim military were based in Sarajevo, they were based in Srebrenica, Tuzla, Bihać, and then Žepa. So the idea behind the safe areas was, okay, well, if you're going to make them a safe area for civilians, then you can't really at the same time have them as the basis of armed forces. Anne-Marie very generously has posted a link to an article that I wrote defining genocide now. So they these were the basis for the Bosnian Muslim armed forces. Now, in those UN Security Council resolutions, it was the clear understanding that these safe areas would be disarmed. They were never disarmed. There was never any attempt to disarm them, and therefore they were used as bases from which to attack the Serbs. And then the Serbs would respond by attacking these cities. And then the media would, oh, the Serbs are attacking a safe area. The Serbs are attacking civilians. But of course, the Serbs were just attacking in response to the Muslim armed forces. And that's what happened in Srebrenica. That basically Srebrenica was used continuously to mount armed forays against local Serb villages. Now, the problem was obviously that was this was 1995. The war was getting quite intense, and particularly the fight over Sarajevo, and the Bosnian Serb armed forces really couldn't take this constant distraction that they had to deal with these forays out of Srebrenica. So they essentially decided to bring the Srebrenica safe area to an end. In other words, just to move in and defeat the 28th Division that was based in Srebrenica. Now, this is where everything becomes quite mysterious, and things that we really don't know the answers to it, because somehow or other, the leadership of the Bosnian Muslims had got wind of the Serbian plan to enter Srebrenica, and the commander of, there's quite a formidable figure, the commander of the 28th Division and the commander in Srebrenica, Nasser Oric, had mysteriously left Srebrenica shortly before the Serbs entered Srebrenica. But then what was really interesting was that these men and boys, these Bosnian Muslim men and boys, withdrew from Srebrenica. Now, this is where it gets quite intriguing, because yes, if these things happen, your armed forces withdraw. But one thing you don't do when an army withdraws, you don't leave your women and children behind. And that's why we've seen these scenes in wars where an army is retreating, but along with the retreating army go the women, children, the elderly, because you don't leave them behind. But they left the women and children behind. And the Dutch BAT, the Dutch battalion, who was there kind of assigned to protect the safe area, even though the safe area didn't really need any protection, and they were observing the use of Srebrenica to attack neighboring Serb villages. They, during the debriefing that took place after Srebrenica, said they all expressed disgust. They said, well, I've never seen anything like this. I've never seen soldiers withdraw from a city and leave their women and children behind. I've never seen anything like this. That's what they said in the debriefing. Now, what then happened is, as I say, kind of mysterious. So first of all, these armed forces were withdrawing in broad daylight. And, well, if you're withdrawing in broad daylight and if you don't surrender, you get shot. They were withdrawing across front lines and they were shot. And many of them were killed during this withdrawal. I mean, this is just an insane policy. Again, but this was clearly driven by the Muslim leadership to encourage essentially an insane military retreat across lines, which was going to end in enormous casualties. So, that hence the 8,000 men and boys. But there were some executions that took place. Some of these retreating soldiers were captured and they were executed. Now, why the executions happened is always a kind of a mystery. Maybe there was some revenge aspect to it, because after all, these Muslims had committed atrocities. These Muslim forces had committed real atrocities against the Serbs, so there may have been, a revenge factor. But what's interesting about that is that the ICTY, which said, "Oh, genocide! This is genocide! No, they could never prove it. That's a genocide." They never could establish who gave the order for the executions, because there's no evidence that Ratko Mladic, the commander of the Bosnian Serb armed forces, had given the order. There's no evidence that Karadzic had given the order for the executions. And the one person who testified at the ICTY of having carried out these executions, which is Drazen Erdemovic. He wasn't even a Serb. He was a Bosnian Croat. Also, he was a mercenary, and was clearly suggesting that somebody or other had paid him and paid some others to carry out this execution. And so that really raises all the questions whether this was always a kind of Western intelligence operation in order to generate this worldwide hysteria about the Serbs, and that led to that was a crucial event. That it led to the big bombing of the Serbs. So those are the major bombing of the Serbs followed Srebrenica, and that was the key thing. That was the crucial thing that NATO, Richard Holbrooke, wanted to accomplish, and that's why it still remains a mystery. And of course, the ICTY made no real effort to find out who gave the order for the execution. We don't even know how many people were executed. As I say, the one that keeps saying there's 8,000 men and boys. Most of them, if 8,000, I mean, this is a number again just plucked out of thin air. But most of the people who were killed, who had some connection with Srebrenica, however many thousand it was, were killed during the retreat, that foolish retreat across Serb lines. So here was a typical article from The Guardian today. They run the same article every July the 9th, July the 10th, July the 11th in the Guardian, Politico. They all do this. They wheel this out, and it's the same thing. Say the voices of our dead have not faded away. The fight for the memory of genocide in Srebrenica. So, I got a lot of flack the other day when I expressed some hesitation in saying that what's going on in Palestine was genocide. And I mean, I don't question at all the horror, the absolute horror and monstrosity of what's going on and what Israel has done to the Palestinians in Gaza. My hesitation is that the using that word genocide, because the moment you accept that, the moment you use that kind of language, you're going to find that term is going to be used against you or those that you support. Because the moment you say, okay, right, we'll call this genocide, the very next day they're going to say Russia is committed genocide. They're going to do that. I mean, you're essentially legitimizing the kind of the haphazard use of genocide. I mean, it may be. Maybe you could prove that what Israel is doing is genocide, but the point about that is that with genocide, the two components to genocide. Same with any crime. You have the act itself, and then you have the intent. So you need that. You need both. Two distinct elements to the crime. So you have to have that the intent. And particularly, you think genocide the worst crime there is. You need to have it's a very high standard of proof. You're going to have to really come up with very strong evidence of intent, and that's where it gets a little difficult. I mean, Netanyahu has been around Israeli politics. He's been at the top of Israeli politics for 30 years. He's the prime minister. He's the one who issues these orders. So if he had genocidal intent, why has he never acted on this genocidal intent in over 30 years? And now, he's brutal, cruel, inhuman, all of that. But you have to have the genocidal intent, and maybe it'll happen that it'll be established. But you see, the difference lay with the Holocaust and World War II and the Nazis is, it wouldn't be that hard to establish that genocidal intent. I mean, you're gonna start with, you're gonna go to Mein Kampf. You'll say, well, Hitler wrote this. It's in Mein Kampf. Then you go and go through his speeches, his tirades against the Jews. Okay, then you're going to go to the laws, the anti-Jewish laws, the succession of anti-Jewish laws that Nazi Germany passed. And you step by step, you say, well, you accumulate all of that. That's a pretty strong evidence for genocidal intent. So you have to do something comparable in the case of Israel. So that's why I was just hesitant, and everyone just criticized me for that. But the problem with that, with the people who criticized me, is that they were essentially using a circular argument. They were saying, okay, well, here, look at all the things that Israel is doing. That can only be genocidal intent. So they're essentially reading the genocidal intent from Israel's actions. But you can't do that, because essentially then you're using one element of the crime and try to get a second element out of the first one. Well, you can't do it. There are two separate elements that you have to act on. So you say, yeah, look at these horrible, inhuman conditions that Israel is imposing. Okay. Therefore, there can be no other explanation other than that it's a genocidal intent. And well, that you can't do. You have to come up with some other series of evidences intent. Anyway, I mean, look, I've got Anne Marie is let's see. I want to read what Anne Marie said. She's let me go to the place. So here, let me go back. So Anne Marie says, "I'm only halfway through, but it's truly fantastic. Thank you." And then Anne Marie says, "Where was the evidence that Milosevic intended to commit genocide?" There was no evidence. There was no evidence. There was no Mein Kampf among Milosevic's publications. Nope. There were no racist speeches. Milosevic had made no derogatory comments about other national groups. He had never touted the supposed racial superiority of the Serbs over their neighbors. He had never advocated the creation of a greater Serbia. But it says, quoting from your article, "Isn't this, beside writing a book like Mein Kampf, everything Israel has done?" Well, I think you would have to say, that's why I think that the reason why I hesitate in the case of Israel is that, yes, they've all of these inhuman things that they've done, but when you say genocidal intent means you want to extinguish a people, you want to make sure that these people cease to exist, and then you have that, and then you're going to have to find in somewhere in the speeches or in some expressions where that's the goal, that they intend to ensure that these people don't exist. Now, Israel has been living with the Palestinians for many years. Of course, they've treated them barbarically and cruelly and so on. But have they really done what needed to be done in order to ensure that they don't exist? I mean, Israel took over the West Bank and Gaza in 1967. That's almost 60 years ago. I mean, if they had the intent to extinguish the existence of these people, well, why haven't they done it during these 60 years? And they're still not doing it in West Bank. Again, they're doing horrible things. I'm not defending that. I was just saying, if you're doing genocidal intent, then you have to say, well, why have they haven't done anything about it for 60 years? And that I think that's really the issue. You just simply saying, well, these are horrible, cruel things. Look at how many people are dying. Yeah, all of that is true. But you have to do more. Now, some of the pronouncements by, I think either Ben-Gvir or Smotrich, or was it or Gallant, the defense minister, some of them did suggest genocidal intent. And in that ICJ ruling, they did say, hey, these comments are very troubling, because you go down this path, then you can say, that is prima facie evidence of a genocidal intent. But nonetheless, they're not people who are in charge of the Israeli government. I mean, it's ultimately, you'd have to say it's Netanyahu. You'd have to show that he is pursuing a policy that demonstrates genocidal intent. Now, you see, the case of Srebrenica was really ludicrous, because first of all, they didn't have the genocidal intent. Who has the genocidal intent? Who was it? Karadzic? They tried vainly look through his speeches. He said something like, nothing in the case of Milosevic, absolutely nothing that suggested genocidal intent. And then of course they'd have to say, well, who are the people who are to be extinguished? You have to identify a particular people that you're trying to extinguish. I mean, if you do with the case of the Muslims, then you ask, well, how does killing 8,000 Muslims in Srebrenica, how does that extinguish the Muslims of Bosnia? Well, it obviously hasn't. I mean, they're all living there, and they're definitely not been extinguished. So they had that problem. They couldn't get the intent, and then they couldn't identify who the people were who were being extinguished, and they couldn't get in what way executing. Even if you were to agree that executing 8,000 people, which again, there was no proof that they executed 8,000 people. How would that extinguish a people? So they never had anything to do with it, but they did that. The ICTY went ahead with that because they were very keen on inserting this notion of genocide into the international criminal agenda. Because once you can show, there was genocide going on, even though you can't say, well, how does this killing amount to genocide? I mean, it's not a huge number of people. How does this further the goal of extinguishing a people? And who are the people? But they were very keen on that, and the same thing happened in the Rwanda tribal. They say, "Oh, that's genocide," and that's why, if the moment you accept, okay, great, we'll say Israel is in the business of committing genocide. The moment you do that, they're gonna say Russia. You think that the next trial that's coming will be the trial of Russians, and they will be accused of committing genocide. And they will have the whole thing. They will go through Putin's essay on Ukrainians, that Ukrainians and Russians are one people, and they say that's it. That we've got it. That's our intent. And then Putin has said, various times over the years that essentially Ukrainians and Russians are one people. He's called into question, the need for a Ukrainian state. Boom, they're going to have it. So I'm just unhappy about any of these, this haphazard uses of the word genocide. I mean, people use that word when really what they mean is that really, really horrible evil. Evil. Well, evil is another word. No, exactly. Horrible, destructive, monstrous, inhuman actions are taking. Somebody says to me, "Why are you defending them?" I'm not. This is exactly the point. Somebody's saying I'm defending. I'm not defending anyone. I said all along that what Israel has done is the most horrific. It's beyond barbaric. It's a savage and cruel. I mean, what more can I say? That's what I think. My only qualm is that I don't want to legitimize the use of the word genocide, because it's going to use haphazardly, and then essentially we're going to get bogged down on what exactly genocide means, how we're going to define it, and whatever. And we saw exactly how this abuse and misuse of the term genocide at the ICTY, when they went ahead, convicted the leaders of the Bosnian Serbs, Ratko Mladic, Karadzic, of genocide, and even even lower level Serbs were convicted of genocide. And then this is how it's going to be done. And then we'll hear the same thing about Myanmar, the leaders of Myanmar. Oh, they're committing genocide. The Rohingya, they're committing genocide against the Rohingya people. And then they say that about Chinese. Oh, China is committing genocide against the Uyghurs. It's going to be everyone's going to be everyone's going to be accused and probably convicted, because once you just use it in any haphazard way, you'll be convicted. So it's a question of be careful what you wish for. You know, you'll be delighted, if one day Israel is convicted of genocide, whether at the ICC, or one day maybe the ICJ will find there was genocide. But it's going to be used against the people that you support soon enough. So I know I just want to stay away from all of that. But anyway, if you look at this article in the Guardian, also the genocide, and here you have where it says 3 decades after genocide. You see, they say this genocide. Why do they say it's genocide? Well, because the ICTY declared it to be genocide, and they had no basis for it, no basis whatever for it, other than the architects of the ICTY, which was Madeleine Albright primarily. They wanted this very badly. If we can do that, we can have that concept of genocide front and center. Then we can just use it against anyone we want. It makes us feel very moral, and it's very good to demonize our opponents. And so here you can see here, more than 8,000 men and boys were killed within a few days following the 11th of July 1995. See, notice how the formulation is so misleading. They were killed. Yeah, a lot of people were killed. That's what happens when instead of surrendering, you continue to retreat. A retreating army is still a legitimate military target. Just because you're retreating, that doesn't mean there's hands-off attitude. There's a hands-off attitude if you're an unarmed civilian. There's a hands-off attitude if you've surrendered and given up your weapons. But if you're a retreating army, you are a legitimate military target. The ICTY always tried to avoid dealing with that issue. And then here we got said Mladic began an attack on the Srebrenica safe areas. The Dutch UN battalion guarding the zone gave up its outposts in the face of the offensive. There was just a handful of Dutch soldiers there. What exactly were they supposed to do? And this says, while many of the Muslim men in the area fled into the woods. Why would men flee into the woods? They were armed. They had arms. Why would they flee in the woods? Why would they leave their women and children behind? That's not what you do. But in fact, and this was the key thing, is that they fled. They left the women and children behind. The women and children were all bussed out, along with the elderly. They were bussed out by the Bosnian Serbs. No one touched them. They were bussed out and went and traveled to the Muslim-held areas. So if you were going to commit genocide, Um, you kind of want to, if your goal is to extinguish a people, then you're going to kill the women and children. I mean, that doesn't really make a lot of sense. You just kill the fighting age men, and you call killing fighting age men genocide. Um, and so the so what was that? Somebody's written. Sauerkraut says, "You heard of a Havara agreement? Germany created Israel, and this was the reason for the transit camps, which were best." Okay, well, the Havara agreement was the agreement whereby Jews left Germany um, and went to Palestine, and they took money with them, but there was also a deal whereby they would purchase goods from Germany. So this money would be used to purchase goods from Germany. This was during the 1930s. Um, anyway, I just want to show that this is the founding myth of NATO, and lo and behold, every year around this time we get the articles about the horrors of Srebrenica, because you have to keep the myth alive. You have to mobilize and engineer and tell us what a fantastic humanitarian organization NATO is. We're the good guys. We're in the business of humanitarian intervention. We're in the business of stopping genocide. Anyway, my time is there. Let's see. Is there anything that I've missed? Yes, there was something I missed. Yes, yes. There's a couple of things I missed. Yeah. Yes. So first of all, Robert said, "I've gotten interested in the New South movement, which saw the likes of Reuben Askew, Jimmy Carter, Lamar Alexander, and so on gain the national spotlight as viable progressive presidential candidates. Do you think there's a chance that Dems might go that route in 2028? J.D. Vance already seems to fit the bill as the Republicans' New South candidate." That's an interesting notion. Well, I mean, I kind of see J.D. Vance at this stage to be more the real MAGA, the real, that somehow the Trumpism without Trump, that his candidacy will be, Trump just was unable to deliver given all his obvious personal flaws, but I J.D. Vance will carry the mantle forward, and I will be a more successful, more accomplished version of MAGA and America First. The I don't know exactly in the case of I mean, Jimmy Carter. If you go back to his campaign in '76, what was crucial to what he did was that the George Wallace um, the hold on, the wrong one. Yeah, the George Wallace vote was still there. Um, he he was able to tap into that, and so yes, he was the New South, and he very skillfully had cultivated the sort of the New South figures in the Democratic Party, so like Andrew Young. But what was crucial to him, what secured him that victory, was that George Wallace uh, constituency. And he was very cagey in '76. About the South and about his views on desegregation. So there was enough in Jimmy Carter to persuade that the people who had voted for Wallace in '68, who voted for Wallace in '72, to persuade them that Jimmy Carter would somehow support their kind of quasi-segregationist agenda. That kind of disappeared by 1980, and that was the disaster that he ran into, because in fact he didn't do any of that during his years in office, and in fact he denied federal funding for the religious schools in the South, because those religious schools were deemed to be segregationists, and that ensured that he lost the South by 1980. I mean, the federal funding for the religious schools, the fact that he didn't even do that, he lost all of that, the Jimmy Carter, the George Wallace vote. Um, by 1992, I guess you had the New South. Bill Clinton managed to win some of that. Al Gore didn't win too much of that, any of the Deep South. So I have my doubts whether the Democrats have any real shot at the South. I mean, they have these congressional districts where which very much black districts where the Democrats can win, but I just don't see anything like the South as being part of their the Democrat constituents. I think that. I think that train has left the station. It's still interesting, though, why what was the, I mean, it's easy to explain the Jimmy Carter phenomenon in '76, but why Bill Clinton managed to win some of the South? Not by no means. I mean, I can't remember exactly which state. I mean, he obviously carried his own state, Arkansas, and I think Al Gore carried Tennessee, but most of the South still went for George H.W. Bush in 1992. I think Bill Clinton won in '92 and '96. I think because the Republicans just fielded such a terrible candidate. I mean, I think that there was just no desire at all for Bush in '92. His numbers tanked really seriously. I mean, he was beyond repair. Really, from early 1992, his numbers were just hopeless. Ross Perot or no Ross Perot, he was going to lose. It's. I mean, I remember sometime early in 1992 with Robert Novak. I used to watch those shows on CNN. Robert Novak, the Capital Gang, and so on. He said the American people, have come to really dislike George Bush. It was very interesting. They really have come to dislike George Bush, and so I think he was beyond saving. So I think that's why Clinton pulled this off. Now. And I think Bob Dole was very, very, very similar. I think there was a dislike for Bob Dole. I mean, he was an eminently unlikable candidate. There was never any chance that people would vote for him. But in 2000, Al Gore, who was again the son of the South, he didn't carry the South at all. He got nothing in the South. So. And that was Al Gore. So I have my doubts that the Democrats can pull that off. It's funny when you say Lamar Alexander. I always think of Lamar Alexander as just being just a wasp. The same kind of waspy figure um, in the South. He's very similar to Brian Kemp, kind of, yeah, vaguely liberal Republican um, figure. Just rolls over for the Democrats. No, he's never really going to stick up for any particular principle or anything. So I always thought Lamar Alexander's candidacy was just uh, so it was just laughable why anybody would do it. So I don't know. I just don't. I don't. See. I mean, it's just not really where the battle lines are any longer. That it's like the South has been more or less settled. I mean, it's the South is now pretty much the Republicans' backyard. They've there's no way you can challenge them there. I think everything will depend. I think is the industrial Midwest. Can the Democrats field a candidate who will have that kind of economic populism that Trump has championed, which will appeal to the industrial Midwest? I think that's really where the battleground is now. Um, I I don't think any of the candidates, as far as I can see, has much can do. I mean, I don't think they have much of a shot so far, but somebody could emerge who would have an appeal in the industrial Midwest. Um, I don't I don't think it's Gavin Newsom, but I don't know. I mean, I just don't see the South as being there. I mean, that's why I think J.D. Vance would be much more not a kind of the New South. I think J.D. Vance would be making a pitch for the industrial Midwest. This is where we have to protect Americans, protect American jobs, and the American way of life. And I think that's where the battle is. Anyway, thank you so much, Robert. Really appreciate that. And then Aristotle once says, a left field questions, what do you think about, quote, handlers, people employed to manage human assets? Seems odd to think that such networks and such control by shady forces exist, but they clearly do, as does the employment of sex as partners and prostitutes to control people. Doesn't Epstein reveal a dangerous reality? And I'll skip mentioning Israel. Um, hmm. Well, I think that would be, um, and I mean, it's an interesting question. Um, the the thing about if you let's say the example that you give of sex, okay, no question, sex has been used since time immemorial to coerce, to blackmail people. But you can only use sex to coerce and blackmail people if they are poor and if they're vulnerable. But you can't do it with very rich people, because rich people, they don't need Epstein to procure whatever they want to procure, whether they want to procure, high class prostitutes, or whether they want to procure very young women, or they don't have difficulties. You're Bill Gates. You can pretty much get whatever you want. You don't need Jeffrey Epstein to find women. I mean, it's like, or if your taste runs to boys, you can find young boys. I mean, if you have wealth, where it's can be it's very useful is when people are vulnerable. Now, let's take the example which we were talking about the other day with Mordechai Vanunu, the Israeli whistleblower who went to the Times of London and with the information about Israel's nuclear program. Israel got wind of this and used the honey trap to get Vanunu. Now that's something that can be done. I mean, if you're, I can't remember what he looked like, but I'm sure he was, an ordinary kind of schlub, and then suddenly some beautiful woman comes onto you. Well, too many people don't use their heads in such situations, and they fall into the honey trap. And of course, what happened with him is that he flew to Rome with her, and then once he was in Rome, he was abducted, drugged and abducted and taken to Israel, and then spent I don't know how many years in prison. So that sort of thing is absolutely done. I mean, you go somewhere and then they film you in a hotel engaging in illicit sex. The other thing that's quite problematic is that there was a time when you could blackmail people. I mean, it's like when there was a respectability and clearly certain things were prohibited, certain things were deeply felt to be deeply shameful and unacceptable. Let's say you had tastes for towards as you were a married man and you had a taste for young boys. There was a time when that's a problem. If they've got you on film in that, and if this is disclosed, then not just you've lost your job, but you've lost your reputation. You're going to lose your wife, your family, everything's gone, and so that would be an incentive to play the blackmailer. But these days, it's very hard to think of anything that is so reprehensible, so unacceptable that it'll be enough to destroy your life and reputation. I mean, it's just it's more or less everything is now out in the open. Everything is acceptable. So it's still hard to think of anything at all that Epstein or whoever would have on you that it would be so horrific, so terrible that I'm ready to work with Mossad. I'm ready to do your bidding because this is if this came out, I would be done for. Nobody these days is done for. Engaging in all sorts of perversions. They say, well, hey, life is for the living. You can, let's live and let live. It's a different world from what the world was, say, even 30, 40 years ago. So that's why I'm skeptical about the Epstein case. And, as we were saying talking about with Peter the other day, is that I'd like to see some evidence. I mean, if he really was running this international blackmail ring using illicit photos, illicit films, and so on, to blackmail people into either doing it, I don't know what. Well, let's see some evidence. Just give us something. Give us some film of some important person engaging in something scandalous. But if you don't have anything, then you're left with speculation, and that's why I've been a skeptic about Epstein, all of this time. But just to conclude on one on this question, I don't see that rich people need Epstein for anything. I mean, if you're Bill Gates, what do you need Epstein for? You're much richer than he is, and you can get whatever you want. Once you have serious money, well, you can always buy whatever you want. You can always buy it. The most the worst kind of perversion you can imagine. You can always pay for it. Anyway, that's my thoughts at the moment. Anyway, thank you so much, everybody who joined me. Thank you above all for all of your really interesting questions and comments, observations, and refresh the page. Yeah, just to conclude, thank you, everybody. And we will be back next week for the live stream, and then we'll do some recordings over the weekend. So thank you. Goodbye. Good night. See you soon.